Dr. Coffey, and appreciate very much being able to be invited to this meeting. It means a lot to us, so we'll do our very best to deliver something worthy of the time that we occupy. This research, as you gather then, is the outcome of a companionship between North Carolina State researchers and the Hanover Company. I want to just say something quickly about purpose. David has asked that I, since I have a bit of gray hair, just give a bit on the purpose and perspective. The paper simply deals with fat-derived essential fatty acids. I started my career as a graduate student looking at fat in late gestation and also in lactation, but we really tripped and fell over the fact that with the modern sow producing the number of pigs that she's producing, essential fatty acids is the name of the game. And fat is not as beneficial when in fact you full feed, and you full feed 7 days a week. And those are two changes. And so where we're going with this is we're simply saying that the essential fatty acid requirement has to be met in lactation, and that determines the benefit in subsequent reproduction. There is no problem in getting sows pregnant. Even in the summer part of the year, there's no problem. The issue is maintaining the conception. And that's a very important issue, not only to us, but to humans as well. In terms of perspective, in the past, we've looked at trying not to cause too much problem, but the value of lipid was especially, according to Jack Britt in his reviews early on, was it was a caloric intake that we needed to achieve with it. Because of a lower heat increment, we were able to get a little better caloric intake. Now, if you listen to Bud Harmon, and I listened carefully, I said at his footsteps many years, the value of high-fat diets and high-octane diets was best shown in even when the sows weren't rearing very big litters, where it was a limit feeding system. When the producer was full feeding the sows, it was most difficult to show repeatedly that the high-octane diets, as they called them, had value. It was limit feeding that caused the advantage to be shown, and that's part of the problem when you look at the literature over the last 30 years. You get some plus, some minus, and part of it is probably due to the fact that some full-fed and some didn't, and you can't tell from the papers if they full-fed or not. They might have said it. Now, the point of this is that in Oklahoma, we're very likely at times to feed milo. That's where half of our commercial sow base is. We're expanding there because of the new Triumph plant. But when you feed milo, and it's an area where tallow is available, and you might or might not feed, feed any DDGs, depending, then conception is always in the 90s. But the 3 to 5% feral rate reduction can't be maintained. It simply cannot be maintained. I can't put enough tallow in the diet. And so we've seen these changes over the years, and George Foxcroft and I agreed that it must be nutrition. Finally, there are a number of critical points for lactation, and meeting those is important to getting good subsequent reproduction. But we're going to add one to it. First of all, with the litters we have today, we have to have adequate body size. You cannot feed around a body size that's too small for the litters we have today, and that's especially important for the first litter, gently important for the second litter, not so relevant after that. Full feeding has to be 7 days a week. Not 5 days a week, not 4.5 days a week, 7 days a week. And it has to start soon after the sow has farrowed. And what you're striving to get is maximum calorie intake to preserve body fat loss, which can impact reproduction. But you also want a proper amino acid intake, and Laura Grinder and others have really helped to that. But the new boy on the block, a new child, is that fat is important, and it looks like I'm done. But from the standpoint of essential fatty acids, and today in our valuing the fat for our farms, we don't value it for sows based on dollars per unit of energy. We value it that way for growing pigs. We value it on what it costs to provide the parental essential fatty acids. And so I'm going to turn it over to David, who really knows a lot about this. So.
Okay, so the research objectives of our studies were to improve the nutritional programs of the modern lactating sow. Okay, this is a high prolific and high producing animal. Okay, she needs to provide all the nutrients for the large and fast growing litter. And here is only an illustration and the amount of milk that she is able to produce during 21 days of lactation. We estimate that the modern lactating sow, a high-producing sow, is able to secrete more than 230 kilograms over the 21 days of lactation. But notice the amount of nutrients she needs to be secreted. Now, she will be secreting about 17 kilograms of fat during the 21 days of lactation. So to support this large and fast-growing litter, she has to secrete a large amount of nutrients. So relative to her body weight, she's able to produce the same amount of milk per kilogram basis as the high-producing dairy cattle. So this is only to illustrate the high potential of milk production that the sow has. So a sow will be producing about 67, 69 grams per day. But what I want to highlight in this slide is that because of the different composition in the milk, different composition from sow and from dairy cattle, she's able to produce more than 40% lactose, 30% more fat, and 25% more protein during lactation. So although those two animals are producing similar amount of milk, the sow is able to secrete a larger amount of nutrients because of the composition of the milk. Just to highlight the high potential of the milk-producing sow, the high-producing sow, and the high levels of nutrients that she is producing over the lactation. So our purpose of the studies was to we learned these sows are secreting so much nutrients. We want to minimize all the body reserve mobilization. And because of that, we like to maximize the long-time productivity of this animal. So going to the first experiment, in the first experiment, we investigated the impact of the level and type of lipids during lactation. We fed sows increasing levels of lipids during lactation. We fed different types of fat. So in these experiments, we fed animal vegetable blend in blue and choy white grease in red. So the efficiency of feed utilization on this study was slightly improved, but only for choy white grease that is shown in red, but no for animal vegetable blend. Well, we know there's some difference in quality and composition of the fats, but we were expecting also a greater contribution of the fat on the performance of the animal, and we didn't see that. But the most significant finding of this study was that when sows consume at least 2% fat or of either source, they improve the farrowing rate compared to a diet that did not contain any fat. So that was very significant for us. We were able to correct a low farrowing rate by providing fat to the diet. The graph in the right is showing the subsequent litter size. So consistently with the farrowing rate, what we observed was that increasing levels of fat in the diet linearly improved the subsequent litter size of those sows. So here is where we had our turning point in our understanding of the lipid nutrition for the lactating sow. Two different fats, animal vegetable blend and soy white grease, they produce different effects in lactation. So we observed the different effects in the efficiency of feed utilization. But those two fats, they have the same positive effects on the subsequent reproduction. Maybe it was more than a caloric effect what we observed in the subsequent reproduction. Maybe, and perhaps, a deficiency or a deficit in essential fatty acid was satisfied by providing any of these sources of fatty acids. So then we focus our further research in the essential fatty acids. And here is only an illustration to remind you of these fatty acids. We know there's two families of essential fatty acids. It's omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. These are essential because these need to be provided in the diet. The animal is not able to synthesize these fatty acids in the body, so she needs an external supply of these fatty acids. And here, I wanted to point out that there's two parent essential fatty acids. It's linoleic, an omega-6 fatty acid, and alpha-linolenic, an omega-3 fatty acid. From these fatty acids, through desaturation and elongation, longer chain fatty acids are being synthesized. And we are more familiar with those longer chain fatty acids. Arachidonic acid in the omega-6 family, eicosapentaeonic acid, or EPA, and DHA on the omega-3 fatty acids. But just taking account that these fatty acids are being synthesized or elongated from the parent essential fatty acid. So we focus our research in the two parent essential fatty acids, linoleic and alpha-linolenic acid. So I mentioned that these fatty acids, they have to be provided in the diet to the sow and to the animals. So these fatty acids, a great proportion, more than 90%, are absorbed into the body. A proportion will be incorporated into the cell membrane. Other fatty acids will be elongated and converted to other metabolites that are important for reproduction and other important biology in the animal. But for the case of the lactating sow that is secreting these fatty acids into the milk, a proportion of the fatty acids that are absorbed will go into the milk fat. But if this proportion is lower than the amount that is provided in the diet, then the animal will have to mobilize these fatty acids from body tissues. So this relationship, the intake of these fatty acids and the milk secretion, is what we call the balance of essential fatty acids. And we think this is important because there are some instances or situations where the sow will be mobilizing of these fatty acids, where sows will be secreting higher levels of these fatty acids than the amount of fatty acids that are provided in the diet. And those are the cases where we're going to have a negative balance of these fatty acids. When sows are secreted a greater amount in the milk than the amount that we provide them in the diet. Okay? So to study this balance of essential fatty acid, we conducted our second experiment. What we did here is to randomly assign 50 sows to a 2x2 factorial arrangement. We use a low and a high level of linoleic and alpha-linolenic acid. And very important in the design of our experiment was that we designed isocaloric diets. So all our diets contain the same caloric density and the same level of lipid, 4%. Okay? We were able to obtain the different levels of these fatty acids by blending different sources of fat. So we use canola oil that is high in oleic and low in linoleic and alpha-linolenic. We use corn oil that is a good source of linoleic acid. And we use flaxseed oil, which is a good source of alpha-linolenic acid, the omega-3 fatty acid. So for the balance, so what we did here was to collect milk samples to measure these fatty acids in the milk to estimate the output, and we knew the input of these fatty acids. So in this graph, I'm showing the balance of linoleic acid. In the red bars, I'm showing the dietary intake, so how much we provided in the diet to the animal. And in the blue bars, I'm showing the output in the milk. When we supply a low level of linoleic acid, 2.1%, notice that the output can be sometimes greater than the input of the fatty acid. And that's where we think we're running into the negative balance for this linoleic acid. By supplying a greater level of linoleic acid, we were able to correct that negative balance and produce a positive balance, which we think is important for the subsequent reproduction of animals. A similar graph, but for alpha-linolenic acid, the omega-3 fatty acid, is presented in this slide. Again, red bars showing the dietary intake and blue bars showing the output in milk. For sows that were provided low levels of alpha-linolenic acid, in this case 0.15%, notice again that we can run into a negative balance for this fatty acid. So we're providing a low level of this fatty acid, and the sow is able to secrete a similar level, but we might be running into a negative balance. That is corrected when we supplemented the diets with 0.45% of linolenic acid. So from here, we estimated that the sow will need more than 10 grams per day of this alpha-linolenic acid. For the case of linoleic acid, we estimated the sow will need at least 100 grams per day because she will be secreting so much, and we will need to provide more than 100 grams per day to correct that negative balance that could occur. Okay, so how is this positive balance will create a positive situation in the subsequent reproduction of the animal? This was a study in a TER experiment where we investigated what were the adequate levels of these essential fatty acids to improve the subsequent reproduction. We conducted the study in a commercial facility using 480 sows. Sows were balanced by parity, so we used parity 1 sows and parity 3 and 5 sows, so mature sows versus young sows. Sows were allotted randomly to a 3x3 factorial arrangement, so we use increasing levels of linoleic acid again and increasing levels of alpha-linolenic acid. And we focus our response in the subsequent farrowing rate and the subsequent litter size. We learned that's where we'll have greater impact, and that's what we observed into the experiment. We did measure performance during lactation for the sow and for the litter, but we didn't find any improvements with increasing levels of either fatty acid. So what I'm going to focus in the results is the subsequent reproduction of the mature animal. We observe a non-linear effect for the young animal with increasing levels of linoleic acid, but the response and the positive response was more evident for the mature animal. So I'll be showing the results for the mature animal, parity 3 and 5. Here are the results for increasing levels of linoleic acid from 2.1 to 3.3%. 3.3% linoleic will be represented in the symbols, the square symbols. The graph in your left is showing the cumulative proportion of sows that were bred after weaning. So sows that were consuming the very highest level of linoleic acid, the omega-6 fatty acid, return faster to estrus, but within the 15 first days of after weaning, most of the sows in either in any of these dietary treatments, 90% of these sows return to estrus. At day 15, we didn't observe any difference among treatments for linoleic acid. The graph in your right is showing the cumulative proportion of pregnant sows. So these sows conceived. 90% of those sows were returned to estrus and were bred, and they conceived. But notice, this is the most significant finding in our research, is that sows that were fed during lactation, at least 2.7% of linoleic acid, were able to maintain pregnancy. Sows that were fed the lowest level of linoleic acid, 2.1%, they lose pregnancy during gestation. And that is what Dr. Dean was referring in the case of our system in Hanor. There has been situations where conception rate and farrowing rate, they are 10 points apart. And that's where we had these seasonal infertility issues. And we believe it's because of that, because sows that are not consuming an adequate level of this linoleic acid are not able to maintain pregnancy. Okay, these graphs are showing the results for alpha-linolenic acid, the omega-3 fatty acid, increasing levels from 0.15 to 0.45%. In this response, we observed something different. Sows that consumed the lowest level of alpha-linolenic acid didn't return as fast to estrus as sows that consume higher levels of alpha-linolenic acid. So for the sows consuming 0.15% that are shown in the triangles, a lower proportion of those sows return to estrus. Okay? And again, we observe interesting findings. We observed interesting things on the sows that were able to maintain pregnancy after they conceived. Only sows that were fed the very highest level of alpha-linolenic acid, 0.45%, were able to maintain pregnancy to a good level. Okay, sows that consume 0.15 and 0.30% of this alpha-linolenic acid, they lose pregnancy in a greater proportion. So in combination, because we had these reproductive issues during for sows not returning into estrus and for sows not maintaining pregnancy, we observed some significant difference in the culling rate. Okay, so this graph is showing a culling rate for the sows, and notice the two bars here, the white and the light red. These are sows that consume a low level of alpha-linoleic acid and a low level of linoleic acid. They resulted in a greater proportion of those sows that were culled after weaning. If we increase the level of linoleic acid or alpha-linolenic acid, that corrected those issues, and we observed less of those sows being culled during the study. So how is this connected then with the balance we were proposing needs to be corrected to improve reproduction? What we did here is to group the sows based on the essential fatty acid balance. So sows that were consuming a negative balance, sows that consume a low level of this fatty acid, had a poor farrowing rate. When we corrected the balance and created a positive balance with high levels of linoleic acid or alpha-linolenic acid, that farrowing rate was improved. So this is demonstrating that when we correct the balance of these fatty acids, when these sows consume the adequate levels of either linoleic or alpha-linolenic acid, then we were able to correct the poor farrowing rate. Okay, so in this next slide, I'm showing the results for the subsequent litter size. The graph in the left is showing the increasing levels of linoleic acid, the omega-6 fatty acid. And for this fatty acid, we observe a linear improvement with increasing levels of the fatty acid. So increasing the level of this linoleic acid in the diet linearly increased the number of pigs that were born in the subsequent cycle. We didn't observe the same effect for alpha-linolenic acid, and alpha-linolenic acid didn't result in greater subsequent litter size. In the next slide, I'm going to show where we think the difference of these litter size are coming from. So this is a graph of the distribution of the subsequent litters by increasing levels of linoleic acid. So we said, and we found that increasing linear improvement with increasing levels of linoleic acid. And the difference we think is coming from having a smaller proportion of sows farrowing smaller litters. So sows that farrow a litter between 8 and 12 pigs, that proportion of sows was reduced when we improved the linoleic acid in the diet. So those sows with consuming higher levels of linoleic acid, they had larger litters in the subsequent cycle. And that's where the difference is coming from. By increasing the level of linoleic acid, we're able to shift the population in the subsequent litter size. So we observe an improvement in farrowing rate, and we observe an improvement in subsequent litter size for increasing levels of linoleic acid. We were proposing that these sows need to consume at least 100 grams per day of the linoleic acid to compensate or to correct any negative balance. How is that related with the levels that we provided to the animals? We provided 2.1, 2.7, and 3.3%. Notice that even with the lowest levels, a proportion of sows consume at least 100 grams per day. But that was only 50% of our population. We need to make sure we provide this requirement to a greater proportion of our population. When we provide 3.3% in the diet, we were providing the minimum requirement of 100 grams per day to 95% of our population. Because we have to recognize that there is a variation in the feed intake of those animals. So those animals will be consuming different levels of linoleic acid. And by recognizing the variation and by learning and applying this principle of knowing that sows need at least 100 grams per day, and if we can provide the 100 grams per day to a great proportion of our population, then we can correct different reproductive issues if we have it in our herd. So these possible mechanisms for the effects of essential fatty acids have been proposed by dairy cattle researchers for the last 10 years. So this is not a new topic. They have been finding positive response to linoleic and alpha-linolenic acid and have proposed different mechanisms. So when we feed linoleic acid or alpha-linolenic acid during lactation, we like to promote a nutrient health. So we like to increase the arachidonic acid, which later is going to be metabolized into prostaglandins, and that promotes inflammation. Well, at birth, that is what the sow needs, is promotion of inflammation just to correct any, or to battle against any germs that went into the sow during farrowing. We also, and during the follicle and oocyte development, we need to improve the quality of the membrane of these reproductive cells. Okay, these cells play these fatty acids, they play an important role in the quality of that membrane, an important role on these cells, reproductive cells. So researchers have proposed an increased numbers and size of follicles with increasing levels of these essential fatty acids. And one very interesting mechanism that has been proposed is the action of these fatty acids on a nuclear receptor, PPAR delta. These fatty acids activate these receptors, which are important for prostaglandin production and pregnancy recognition. So what I would like you to take home from this presentation and these studies is that we have to understand that sometimes there might be an essential fatty acid deficiency that can occur. And just to correct that, we have to understand the principles. We believe the sows need to, an adequate level will correct any negative balance of these fatty acids during lactation. We believe that maybe in the cases of heat-stressed sows or sows, mature animals, or sows nursing large litters, that's where we can see this negative balance. By supplementing essential fatty acid, we will improve subsequent reproduction. We're proposing that the minimum requirement of 100 grams per day for linoleic acid and a minimum requirement of 10 grams per day for alpha-linolenic acid And the other finding was that this alpha-linolenic acid, we believe, can compensate for any deficiency of linoleic acid. And before we finish, I took Dr. Lindemann title here, dietary fat is more than an energy source. As Dr. Dean said, we used to value our fats based on the unit, the cost per unit of energy that the fat provided. And we continue doing that for our growing pigs. Okay? But that's the way we used to value the different sources we had. Which one of these is providing the lowest cost per unit of energy? Well, with these studies, we have changed the way we value these lipids into the sow nutrition program. Because we have to recognize that different sources have different levels of linoleic and alpha-linolenic acid. We have to value them differently. So the way we value in our system is by selecting sources that provide the least cost per unit of the essential fatty acid. And just to take a quick comparison here, if we compare soybean oil that has 51% linoleic acid against tallow that has only 3% linoleic acid, the cost in our diets of adding tallow will be 15 times more than adding soybean oil if we want to meet the requirement for linoleic acid. And with that, I would like to thank your attention and take any questions that you might have.
Perfect storm there because you're feeding milo and tallow, and milo's got less fat than corn does by only a third as much about, and then tallow, yeah. So,
yeah.
Have you looked at other parts of your operation? You're not feeding tallow and you're not feeding milo.
Yep.
So what in a common corn, soy, choice white greens diet? How much linoleic acid is in there?
In a common corn soybean meal. Choy white grits, you might have 2.5% linoleic acid. So yeah, pretty close, and not only that you're providing a sufficient amount of linoleic acid during lactation, but you might be providing also during gestation and creating a better environment. So that is a very good question, and we were unlucky to be situated in Oklahoma, where we don't have much access to DDGS and other vegetable oils or animal vegetable blends. We just happened to have tallow in our hands and happened to see those negative responses. We have evaluated North Carolina. North Carolina has a different situation. We had more access to greases and animal vegetable blends. We don't see much of the problem on the gap between conception and farrowing rate there. But applying this technology have allowed us to increase the subsequent litter size. So there's difference, and that's where we need to understand more about these fatty acids, is the mechanism that they are acting. They might be acting in different mechanisms. But for North Carolina, we have observed an increase in the subsequent litter size, and that might be a different mechanism that correcting the negative balance for linoleic.
And you made a good point about the gestation part, because our gestation diet, we could be storing some of these,
yep.
And so in the Midwest, where we're feeding some distillers in gestation and lactation, we may not be as deficient as you were in Oklahoma, for example.
Just take that. Yes. Boy, we may not tag team anymore. This may be it.
You're joined at the hip.
Yeah. The thing is, we raise pigs in Wisconsin as well, and so our corn, soy diet with DDGs and 10% fat, I can get to about 2.6% linoleic acid. But if I'm using what is typically more available to us, 5 and 6% DDG, then I'm at 2.1, and I can get down to 1.98. So again, I can get enough to maximize retention of farrow, of conception, but the extent to which I boost the population of conceived, of the conception depends on getting it higher than that. And so it's been very interesting that we can see in North Carolina, we never did top out like we should have been. But it was obvious to us more obvious to us in Oklahoma. Times it went well, times it didn't went well.
So at the beginning, Dean, when you started, you set your clock back about 40 years when you were doing your master's work, and you showed that if you fed a kilogram of fat to a sow before farrowing, it increased pre-weaning livability. And so now, 40 years later, we're getting litter sizes like we've never seen before. Have you ever thought about trying that again?
You know, it's interesting. At that time, I was able to get some response to fat in terms of pig weight gain. But in looking back on that, I think I probably wasn't actually full feeding. I thought it was, but if I wasn't having to clean something out, I wasn't full feeding. So I kind of tricked myself. But I was at a different Cruz presented a paper in 1977. And he went into this elegant stuff, but the problem was the litter size was so small it didn't matter.
Yeah, but I think maybe I asked my question.
No, I know your question.
Oh.
I just didn't like, I liked a different question.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's okay then.
I'll tell you what, we're actually up against break time, so if you have additional questions, I know they'd love to visit with you. So we're going to take a break. We'll start back. I'll holler at you a little bit before 11. There are refreshments and snacks over here on this side of the room, so we'll break till about 11 o'clock.
You could be somebody's wife.